Hello and welcome to the CyberCX Cyber Dialogue webinar on data sovereignty. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Shannon Lane and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at CyberCX, and I'll also be your moderator for today. This webinar is the sixth in the series we started in the early days of the COVID-19 crisis. We've started to see many of the harshest restrictions ease and a transition back to pre-pandemic normality. However, it looks like some of the changes caused by the pandemic are here to stay. The way we travel, spend and play have all shifted, and many of us will continue to work remotely long after the crisis has passed. We are also questioning systems that we once looked on and took for granted, such as global supply chains. Undeniably, global commerce connected us and brought us a multitude of benefits, but it also introduced unexpected and unforeseen risks. Drawing on these insights and on the specific questions about cyber sovereignty, we are deep diving on this theme today. This week, we'll explore data sovereignty and cloud computing. In follow-up webinars, we'll investigate sovereignty from a skills perspective and then from a cyber threat intelligence perspective. Today, again, we have over 200 registrants for this webinar. The number of attendees and the high quality of the questions that you send through each and every session indicate that the topics that we are covering are adding value, which is very encouraging. So why is data sovereignty such an important and topical issue? The treatment of data under law, consumer rights, personal and data privacy, data security, global trade, and international law are all factors that need to be considered. And whilst these issues are important considerations, some claims about data sovereignty have been a little bit overstated. Thankfully, the Australian Privacy Act provides solid protection and very specific provisions under APP 8 on accountability for disclosing personal information to an overseas recipient, and also the reasonable steps that are to be taken to ensure that overseas parties don't breach our privacy laws. However, many organisations don't have clear cloud strategies or guidelines in place to take advantage of this act. They don't specify where data centres are to be located and what zones can or should be used to host corporate data. Similarly, there's a lack of understanding as to where cloud security starts and ends, whose responsibility it is. The key questions of who is responsible at which phases of the data lifecycle, what needs to be included in the cloud security review, what happens to the data in the event of a cloud provider going bust or entering into liquidation, how can the cloud service model or delivery model impact my security approach and decisions, and what are the risks associated across these models? All these questions need to be carefully thought through and considered. CyberCX is definitely here to listen and to assist and answer these questions and more. And if you're experiencing any cyber challenges or concerns regarding data sovereignty, please share your experiences. We can then work to develop solutions to assist. We have delivered targeted solutions to assist during the COVID-19 crisis, and we will again work to support you as we emerge, whether that be to amplify cyber initiatives for your employees, your networks, or your systems and data. The agenda for today has slightly changed, and based on the request for more detailed guidance, we have changed the webinar format by introducing a quick top 5 cloud security best practices at the top of the agenda, presented by Phil Kernick, the CSO at CyberCX. We'll then jump into the Q&A format that you've become used to, where we will ask our 2 guests the questions that you have sent through. We'll again run 2 polls during the webinar and share the results at the end, and we'll finish with that rapid fire Q&A to answer the online questions that you have sent through whilst you've been listening. Please use the chat facility to lodge those questions. Today, again, we have 2 outstanding guests, Alastair MacGibbon, who has become a feature of these webinars, and Phil Kernick. Before joining CyberCX as the Chief Strategy Officer, Alastair was the National Cybersecurity Advisor and head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre within the Australian Signals Directorate. He was Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on cybersecurity and has served as Australia's first e-safety Commissioner. Alastair established the Australian Federal Police's High-Tech Crime Centre during his long tenure with the AFP and previously worked at eBay as its Senior Director of Trust, Safety and Customer Support. He has also been the local CEO of Information Security Certification Not-for-Profit Crest Australia. Phil Kernick is the Chief Security Officer at CyberCX and an information security thought leader with over 25 years of experience. He has an abiding commitment to helping organisations safeguard their information assets through the implementation of effective cybersecurity strategies and architecture. And throughout his career, particularly as the co-founder and Chief Technology Officer at CQR, Phil has always sought innovative solutions to ensure organisations can address their security needs. In his desire to increase public awareness around cyber threats, Phil produces extensive research documents, white papers, and videos. He appears regularly in public forums and such as industry conferences and in the media. So Phil, I'll hand over to you to run through your top 5 cloud security best practices.
Thanks, Shannon. These are really simple. The thing about cloud is everyone wants it, but everyone needs to understand what they want and how they get it. So let's start with number 1. You need to use a certified cloud provider. And by cloud provider, I mean anything that's offering you software as a service. Let's face it, cloud means using someone else's computer. And when you use someone else's computer, when you buy a service from them rather than running it your own, the only thing that you actually have is a contract. And if you've ever reviewed any of these cloud contracts, they're hundreds of pages long and they all seem to be written to the benefit of the cloud provider and not really you as the consumer. But that's all you've got. You've got the SLA that they'll deliver what they say they'll deliver. But you can't test this. You can't check this. You can't go and say, hi, cloud provider, I'd like to do a security review of you. This isn't something they offer because they might be a hyperscale global company. They might be a local company. They might be anywhere. So what you need to do is have an independent view on the security of your cloud provider. Now, while you can't do that, they can do it for you. And because they have so many clients, the best approach for them is to go and get an international standard independent security review and then talk about it. 2 parts are important here. The first is that it is an industry understood, industry approved, independent certification. And the second is that they're doing it at their cost. They're doing it because they want to tell you that they're going to look after your information really well. Because even if you use a cloud provider, you are still accountable for the data that you store there. You still have to manage the privacy protection of the data that you store there. Now, your users aren't going to care that you outsourced this to someone else and they screwed up, they lost your data. They're still going to hold you accountable. And not only that, the government's going to hold you accountable as well. So very first thing, you've got to use a certified cloud provider. There are a number of industry standard certifications. The international standard for information security management is ISO 27001, and we look for this as the very first certification that you'd expect your cloud provider to have. If they're based out of the US, then they probably won't have ISO 27001, but they might have NIST 800 or SOC 2 certifications. And if you're looking at cloud providers to supply services to Australian government agencies or people who are as secure as Australian government agencies, then you might want to look at the IRAP program that comes out of ACSC. So there you go. Number 1, use a certified cloud provider. That will give you the baseline security above and beyond everything else. So let's look at number 2 instead. Number 2 is that you really need to use one located in Australia. And I'm going to accept this feels a bit rah-rah, this feels a bit pro-us, anti-them, but that's not the reason. This isn't a tinfoil hat argument. This is a consumer and corporate legislation argument. See, Australia has some of the strongest corporate and consumer legislation anywhere in the world, all designed to protect you. And if you're using an Australian cloud provider, or at least one hosted in Australia, then all of that is protecting you. Now, got to be a little careful about saying a cloud provider located in Australia here, because there are a number of them that have sales teams located in Australia, but no infrastructure here, no support here. Those aren't going to give you the same level of coverage and support as one that has really put technology on the ground here and employed people on the ground here to look after you. And if that isn't enough, there are 2 more reasons why local is better. Number 1, the speed of light. This is something we can't beat. We didn't even manage to beat this in Star Trek. If you have a cloud provider located in the US, you are at least 200 milliseconds away. If you're located in some other locations, you might be 300 or 400 milliseconds away. Now, I know that sounds like not very much. That's a half a second away to access your data. But when you're doing a lot of it, it really matters. If your cloud provider is located in one of the big data centers in Australia, you're probably tens of milliseconds away. That's the same activity as if this data was located on your LAN or WAN today. So it's at least as good as local. And there are some protocols and some services that really don't like being that far away. I'm fairly old. I remember phone calls in the 1970s where you spoke and then there was a half-second delay to England when they would call back to you. That's effectively what happens when you're hosting your data overseas. The last piece that makes local better is that you're calling a local person if you have an issue. You're calling a person who is here in your time zone, not up in the middle of the night because they've been contracted to look after the Australian region. Let's go on to number 3. Next thing you have to do is encrypt everywhere. And by everywhere, I mean both in transit, that is on the wire between your endpoint and the cloud provider, and at rest, that is at the cloud provider. Now, the nice thing about the in transit piece is that we've pretty much got this covered. Everybody uses TLS encryption across all of their links all of the time. There's a little asterisk there that you can't see in a webinar that says mostly. But we've pretty much got encryption on the wire covered. What we haven't got necessarily covered is encryption at rest. That is, we want the cloud provider to encrypt your data on the disks at their premises. And we want them to use strong encryption. By the way, if any cloud provider says that they've rolled their own crypto or they've got new special crypto, which is military grade, they always seem to say military grade when they mean they've made it up themselves. Don't use them. There's no such thing. The best crypto is publicly available, has been researched for decades, and is guaranteed to be secure. So why do we want encryption at the cloud provider? We want encryption from them to protect you from them. So when you have the data yourself, when you own the spinning disk that the data is on, you can have physical walls around it, you can go and look at it, you can tell where it is, you can put a whole load of defenses around it to stop anyone getting access to it. But when you're using cloud, you don't even know where those disks are. It's possible they can't even tell you where those disks are. So you can't use necessarily the physical boundaries to keep yourself safe. And you especially can't use it to keep yourself safe from them. Everyone probably has a story where someone has accidentally deleted something, accidentally done something wrong. Well, if that accidental thing happens by your cloud provider, you're in real strife. If the cloud provider hires someone who isn't as trustworthy as they should, and unfortunately, I've got to say, most businesses have had this experience too, then you need to be assured that even a bad actor at your cloud provider can't get access to your data. And that's what's done in the very large cloud providers. You can buy the ability to have your data encrypted at rest so even they can't access it. Even though they are managing the system the data is on, it is impossible for them to access it. And for those of you who are worried about government snooping, not personally something I worry about, but those of you who are, this will keep you safe from that as well. Because it doesn't matter if they came in and took the disks or came in and said, cloud provider, give me the data. They can't because they don't have access to it. So talking data, let's move on to best practice number 4. This is that backups still matter. Now, when people go cloud, their piece of their brain which says, I need to do backup, seems to get turned off a lot of the time because the cloud says, we are highly available. You don't need to do backup because we replicate. We will replicate it between data centers. We'll replicate it between systems. We will guarantee availability. And look, they're right. This is correct. They will do all of those things, but backups cover much more than physical loss. All of the replication that data center providers will provide you by default is all about making sure the data is available. So if power failed and the generators failed and something went wrong, your data would still be available. If a disk fails, your data would still be available. Great, they have that covered. Be very happy about that. But they don't have covered against malware, we've seen large Australian businesses that have used cloud providers suffer malware and ransomware attacks this year. Cloud didn't help them if you don't have backups. Backups also protect you against user error. Again, that I accidentally deleted a thing, I accidentally did something wrong. If you don't have backups, you can't come back from that. And talking to that, it's probably worth bringing back that case of Distribute IT from all those years ago. That organization didn't have backups, but it did have replication. And when the attacker got in and deleted things, that delete got replicated between all of the sites very quickly and replicated the delete and destruction of all of their data almost immediately. Without backups, you can't recover from this. And there's a final reason that backups are really good for you, is it helps you migrate off the platform if you need to. Let's say you've committed to a cloud-based CRM, and at some point you decide that you want to pick a different cloud-based CRM. You need to make sure that you can get your data out of that cloud provider when you choose to leave. Now, this has historically been a bit of a challenge for some cloud providers. They go, we're managing it for you, but we want you to always use us. So we're going to make it difficult for you to get your data back, so you will continue to always use us. You're still responsible for the backups because you're still responsible for the data. And when you're doing the backups, make sure that they're in a different availability zone. Make sure they're somewhere else. Make sure they're not in the same rack that your data is in. And then strongly secure the backups as well, because if attackers want your data, they could go after the original or they could go after the backup. So keep that safe. And finally, I've got a number 5, but this one doesn't involve the infrastructure side. This involves the user side. I'm sure we all know people who've had their accounts compromised. I'm sure you've all seen in the press that yet another, it seems to always be a cloud provider, gets compromised and all of their data, all of their user accounts get done. I remember LinkedIn in 2012. My account at LinkedIn in 2012 was compromised. Now, what we don't want is for users to pick more passwords. We know users are bad at picking passwords. We know that if users pick passwords, they'll probably pick the same password they use on the rest of your corporate systems, which will make you less secure. So any cloud service that you're consuming, especially one which has a connection to users, you need to use federated user accounts. That is, you need to control the user account and tell the cloud provider that someone is connected, rather than forcing your users to create yet another account where they'll probably use the same password as the one they use on their corporate account, making you less secure. And while we're talking users and we're talking user accounts, make sure that every cloud service you consume has the ability to turn on multi-factor authentication for all users. Now, this is critically important for administrators. When you are administering your cloud service, you need to use multi-factor authentication every single time. Because if someone can phish the credentials of one of your administrators, they now control your cloud instance. They could steal all your data, modify all your data, wreck your business. That's absolutely critical, but it's equally important for the ordinary user accounts, because again, with a cloud service, we don't have those firewalls around the outside. We don't have this nice idea of here's the inside network that's all protected and the outside network is the internet. In cloud, everything is the internet. So it's critically important that ordinary users protect their identities using multi-factor authentication. So that's it. That's the top 5. None of these are deeply technical, because none of these are deeply technical problems. We're going to allow the cloud providers and our IT teams to deal with the technical. What we've got to do is make sure we're selecting the right cloud provider that will give us the certification we need, that's located in Australia, that will do encryption to keep us safe, that will allow us to get our data back, and that will allow our users to be safe while using the system.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Phil. That's very helpful. I might jump straight in and welcome Alastair to the Q&A session now, and then propose the first question.
Never been so quiet in my life, Shannon, and that shows you the level of respect I have for Phil. Well, I have a marginal degree of respect for Phil, as he knows. And if you trawl the internet, you see the level of respect he has back for me, but that's another story. But yeah, notice how quiet I was?
I was very impressed, Alastair. That's very significant, so thank you for that. All right. So on to our first question, and I guess we've alluded to this in some of Phil's discussion, but Alastair, if I can throw this one to you, why use Australian cloud providers when overseas providers are cheaper? And what happens to my data in the event of a cloud provider going bust or entering into liquidation?
Great. Okay, well, firstly, let me just say that anyone that knows me knows I was joking there about Phil. We've had a long and productive relationship over the years, and it's a distinct pleasure, Phil, to be now working in the same organisation as you know. Well, Shannon, I could, but we know it's unlikely I will, just say what Phil said. I mean, literally the 5 things that Phil said are the reasons why I think Australians should be using Australian cloud providers, because this isn't just about cost. It's about the latency that Phil referred to. It's about the rule of law and repeatability and all of those issues. In terms of what happens if they go bust, again, Phil's point about backups is really critical. Make sure that you have a copy of your data. I mean, cloud companies are as likely to go belly up as any other business in the world, right? I mean, it's probably less likely than, say, newspapers or traditional media, but there's no doubt that there are going to be people with the wrong type of business model. So we need to prepare for these things. The advice that Phil's given, and we all know in cybersecurity, a lot of smart people will always try to show you why you should have numbers 5 to 36 on the list, or 6 to 36 on the list, and we'll always argue that you should have swapped out number 3 for number 11 or something like that. But I think Phil's advice is right. And so my short answer to the question, which I should have just done, is follow Phil's advice, because that answers this question.
There's also one other thing about that looks a bit like liquidation, which is different, especially in the tech world we're living in now, which is cloud providers get acquired. The service that they're offering you, the one that you really like, they get bought by another bigger provider and go, we don't want that one anymore. That's not interesting to us. So you can actually lose your data and lose your cloud service due to no fault of anybody, except that it didn't look like a good business model for somebody.
And again, I suppose to extend that, Phil, you know, the situation where cloud providers are acquired and the functionality that you've, you know, learned to live with or learned to rely on is now sort of subsumed by the different cloud provider. Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a challenge. And look, if let's talk Microsoft, because we all love Microsoft, and some people will think I'm being cynical. Actually, I do. We moved to Skype for Business. Skype for Business was awesome. It was going to be our comms and communications platform. We set ourselves up for Skype for Business and cloud-based Skype for Business. And now Microsoft has said we're not doing Skype for Business anymore as of July next year. We're all doing Teams. You don't get the choice. You don't get to say, well, I choose to keep using the tech I liked using. Now imagine that this was true of your collaboration platform or your ticketing system or something else. You need to be a lot more agile if you're using cloud, because your data can get migrated, moved, or even turned off because they don't want to support it anymore.
No, good point. Good point. I guess I might flip to you in terms of the next question as well, Phil, and then come back to Alastair with some comments. How many countries, e.g. Australia, have reciprocal agreements with other countries, e.g. the US, for transfer of data? How much protection can we really expect from US cloud providers, e.g. AWS and Microsoft, and even if the data is collected and stored in Australia?
Okay, I'm going to start with saying I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. So, and you know what? I think many of the people, with the greatest respect, many of the people who are wondering about this are also not lawyers. So, but let's start with the first question. Most of the Five Eyes countries, those are Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, and the UK, have a whole load of reciprocal agreements about data protection, about access to data, and about legal access to data. So those all exist. There are a number of agreements and acts which enact this, and they're all Western democracies. They're all good folk. So we can genuinely expect a lot of support from AWS and Microsoft because they have thousands of employees in Australia. They have infrastructure in Australia and they're subject to Australian law. That's the big picture here, is that we can expect everything they tell us because they're resident here and subject to our provisions. And that's the answer to it, really. I don't have much more. Al, what do you think?
Well, thanks, Phil. I think we've got to separate two things here, and I think this theme will come up a few times in this discussion. One is the concept of lawful access, and the other is unlawful access or hacking, or literally unlawful access by a provider. So let's have it in those two buckets. When it comes to lawful access, we've got to accept the fact that countries quite legitimately, by the way, for a long time, you know, you had a thing called the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, for example, that I used to rely upon in the federal police to gather evidence in other jurisdictions where it goes from essentially Attorney General to Attorney General. So there's always been this concept of the flow of information between law enforcement agencies and governments. That act, by the way, is particularly slow. And if you know, I'm sure there are still inquiries I did back in the 1990s that are winging their way somewhere through a legal system. I mean, the reality is there's always been governments that have swapped data for the purposes of enforcing their laws. I do think, and you know, I'm pretty public on this, Shannon and Phil, and not everyone loves it. I would much prefer to trust a liberal Western democracy, such as the US. You know, people might want to hate on their president. That's fine, but that's not the US government, and it's not the US people. So the reality is, your information's pretty well protected legally, and it's the same in Europe. We could talk about the European privacy laws, for example. And the interesting thing, of course, is if you do business in any of those countries, like these big cloud providers do, they also adhere very strictly to the privacy legal provisions in those jurisdictions. Just like a bank who's global has to get the best anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism finance capabilities and all their other obligations. So short answer is, from a legal point of view, I think it's fine. And to Phil's point, encrypt your data if you don't want someone to have access to it. And then you've got the unlawful access, and I suspect we'll come to that later on in this talk. So conscious of time, so I'll shut up there.
Thanks, Alastair. Look, we might jump into the next question, and I think a lot of these questions are similarly themed. So you may get a slight change to the question, but I think that the themes are coming out. So we'll plow on. If Australian data sovereignty isn't...
I'm just reading the question myself here. Please go on, Shannon. But yeah, I'm sorry. I always seem to answer the next question.
No, that's all right. But again, I think it adds, to the fact that a lot of people have interest in these specific answers and specific questions. So it'd be good to sort of get a perspective. Would EU be preferable to the US? And I think you probably answered that. But I guess maybe in specific reference to the Patriot Act, in regard to data sovereignty, does that make data sovereignty irrelevant when hosting with a US-owned company?
No, look, it just doesn't. I'm happy to answer that question 1,000 times over. Sure, the US government has a Patriot Act. We have what some people would consider to be draconian legislation here for the purposes of protecting national security. And I can tell you, every country in the world that is worth anything has legislation that is very draconian to protect its national security. The big question should be, what's the motivation or intent of the agencies in those countries? Now, people can be as jaundiced as they like towards US agencies. I've had the privilege of living and working over in the United States as an Australian government representative in our embassy in Washington. I know a lot of these people personally. I've had the privilege of working with them in subsequent roles in government. And I can say that the US people's respect for individual liberty runs very deep in their veins. In fact, I'd argue it probably runs deeper in their veins than it does in the average Australians. So, people can always talk about overreach and other things, but again, we're talking about a liberal Western democracy. There's a Congress there that does its thing and protects the US people first, but it'll, but it has a conscience. Would information? I have no troubles with my information sitting in Europe, just as much as I have no trouble with my information sitting in the US. But I'd much prefer my information sitting in Australia because I like Australian law and I'm an Australian citizen. But again, long-winded answer. Any company that does business in all those jurisdictions has what's called conflict of laws. Welcome to the reality of a global world. And every nation is going to try to say that its laws take precedence. I've argued that myself to those same providers. But largely speaking, the average punter is fine.
And here's the odd thing about this question. This question is splitting a very fine hair, because what it doesn't say is What about if the hosting was in China or in Russia? And personally, I'd say no to both of those. It's just straight up no to both of those, because they don't have a rule of law like we do here. So rather, I think, than worrying about whether EU, which has probably the strongest privacy protections in the world, will be preferable over the US. Look, AU, US, EU is all good from our point of view, is all good from a security point of view. There are other countries which are really bad from a national security point of view and from a personal protection point of view. Don't store your data there, even if it's cheap. There are a lot of providers in Russia that will offer you virtual private hosting services for nearly nothing. You get what you pay for. You probably get less than what you pay for there. And then China has its Great Wall, which is going to make it really hard to use anyway. So I think don't try and split this hair too fine.
Okay, no, good answer. Thanks, gentlemen. Look, the next question we've got is honestly very, very similar to what we've discussed so far. And I guess I don't really want you to step through that again, but maybe address the last point there, where they've talked about, should this really matter for most of us, whether, the US government or Azure or AWS or Google compute facilities that exist in Australian territory have are exposed to US government legislation and US Cloud Act, etc.
Well, I'm going to go back to not a lawyer. Two things to note, though. The Cloud Act actually it gives us capability. It's not an all US one-way thing. It actually allows us to access information in the US. So that's positive for Australia. But if it really matters to you, then encrypt. You can make this a non-problem. If this is something that you emotionally or philosophically have a real issue with, you can encrypt such that you hold the keys, and it doesn't matter who has legal access. They're still going to have difficulty. If they want legal access, they'll come and see you personally and get the keys. So I don't think this really matters to most of us. I don't think that most of us have data that is of interest to other nation states. Maybe some people on this call do, but the vast majority of us are very boring as far as the intelligence apparatus of countries are. And I'm sure Alastair will tell you that the world is not quite like a movie plot where there's just looking at all your stuff all the time.
Well, Phil, yes, absolutely. In fact, what I'd say, I respect people's concern about overreach in national security legislation, but what I would say is, do they genuinely think the one place you're going to find efficiency in government is inside the deep state, inside the intelligence community of the US or Australia or any other place? I mean, if only that was the case. I mean, we know that isn't the case, and I'm not being rude or cruel to my friends in the intelligence community, but anyone who thinks that it's some ubiquitous, highly efficient machine that is busy hoovering up innocent people's information continually, I'm not going to say they need to wear tinfoil hats, but I'm going to say that they subscribe to a conspiracy theory that does not exist. So, look, the Cloud Act, as you quite rightly said, and I know you don't play a lawyer on TV, though I reckon you'd be a pretty good one, as I mutually support you. Now that you stopped writing bad things about me on the internet, which I wasn't going to mention.
You stop saying silly things. What can I say?
Historical things on Twitter, and you'll see what you think of me occasionally. But is the Cloud Act works in both directions. That's the whole idea. Is Australia benefits just as much from that if there's data domiciled. But I'm just going to say again, one of your tips is encrypt. Encrypt at rest and encrypt in flight, and you dramatically reduce the likelihood of anyone that you don't want to have access to your information. Pretty simple. But these acts, we know, and the last thing I'd say on this is this, and I sound true, like I'm being flippant with it. The reality is these acts are moved by and enacted by Congress or moved and enacted in a parliament like Australia in order to protect their citizens. And we need to respect the fact that nations genuinely, including nations that I don't always agree with, think that they're doing what's right by their nation and their citizenry. It keeps coming down to what's the motivation and what's their intent when it comes to us. The simple reality is the Americans aren't after us. People might think that, and every once in a while you might read it in the paper that they've misstepped in some of their words, at least some of their senior officials. But the reality is they're not after us. If they do come after us, then there are much better ways to do it than having to steal our information out of cloud services that we subscribe to.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. Look, maybe one other dimension of that, and we'll jump to a poll in a minute, but the dimension of intellectual property and the information that companies actually produce to sustain their competitive advantage over time. Do any of those pieces of legislation, the US Cloud Act, the Patriot Act, our own privacy and European legislation around privacy, impact any of that in any ways?
That's all covered by trademarks and patents, and you got to say the US has fairly got that locked up solid. So it's totally different sphere of influence that worries about intellectual property.
Yeah, it's not the US or Europe that steals the intellectual property or the lifeblood out of economies. That's certainly not that of the Europeans or the North Americans. So, and it goes back to one of Phil's points. This is about the rule of law and predictability. If you keep your data in a liberal Western democracy, preferably Australia, I think you are better off.
Okay, very good. Look, and with that, we might turn to our first poll of the day. How actively do you utilize cloud solutions? Extensively, cloud-first attitude. Moderately, we use cloud solutions where appropriate. Limited, we use a small number of cloud applications. None, we don't use any cloud applications. And maybe the last one is you don't know. So I'll probably give it another 15 seconds or so to get the feedback through. Yes. No music. Sorry,
have you got hold music, or is Phil singing?
I think it was Phil singing today. That was we didn't tell you about that. Phil.
Go on, you can have longer than 15 seconds to answer the poll then. Phil, sing away.
I haven't had a beer. I can't do it, mate. It's only 11 o'clock in the morning.
Fair enough. All right. So we good to move on, Mikhail? Fantastic. All right, that's great. So we'll move on to the next question. And again, I think we've probably had such a good treatment of the issues from Phil that we may have answered this one already. What's your view on encrypted backups? I think that's fairly clear. And what's your view on encrypted backups being in different regions? How do I back up if I'm using SAS?
Do you want me to give it a go as the least technical person on this webinar, and then Phil can correct me, which he does online sometimes if you look at historical Twitter. But that's okay. I don't want to sound like I've got a scar or two from you, Phil, over the years. But look, yep, obviously we need to be encrypting our backups, absolutely, just as you should encrypt your non-backed up data that's at rest, right? Because a backup is as important. In fact, it's the keys to the kingdom as well, right? I think by different region, you're meaning if I'm in zone 1, which happens to be in New South Wales, should I store it in zone 2, which is Victoria, or whatever the different zones are? I think Phil's advice is that you should be storing on a separate type of medium, if I hear you right, Phil, and I think that's good advice. So if you're on cloud provider X, look at me for not naming names, I don't think you should keep your your really key backup on that cloud provider. And Phil can answer the SAS question also. Correct me if I've misheard him too.
Yeah, and there are some solutions where backing up to your own cloud provider is possible, but use their backup option. So some of these cloud providers will provide you a specific backup service, which they will then say is in a different availability region to keep that safe. Don't roll your own backups though internally. Like I've got a bunch of disks here and I'll run a backup process that I wrote to stick it on another bunch of disks in the same provider. That's not really backup. As to SAS, it'll be called something different. It'll be called export. So rather than typically calling it a backup where you're thinking about backing up an entire piece of media, an entire computer, an entire storage array, with SAS, you're much more talking about exporting your data. So first make sure that it has the capability to export your data, then make sure you actually can export your data, and then finally do the actual export of your data and then store that somewhere securely as well. But again, if you're talking a CRM or something similar to it, it won't be called a backup, but it almost certainly will be called export. And I check that you can do this before you sign the contract with them, because once you lock in, it might be quite hard to get your data out.
Okay, good advice. And any comment on the, what you should look for in a particular contract? I know you said you're not a lawyer. What should you look for in regard to backup or export?
Well, you specifically want
non-lawyers always give the best legal advice, Phil. So feel free to give it away.
All right, so it should say that your data belongs to you. I would, interesting history, you go back and look at what Facebook used to say. They basically said that they had a right to use your data for any purpose they felt like forever, and you gave them that right simply by using the service. I don't use Facebook anymore, so I don't know what their terms look like today, but that's not good for you. So the first thing is make sure that your service says that you own your data, says you have an absolute right to your data. Make sure that the service level you sign up or somewhere says that you have the ability to get your data off the platform. Now at CyberCX, we use cloud services, and one of the core questions that we ask all of our cloud providers before we will sign up to them, while we're still evaluating them, is, can I get my data out of your system if I choose to stop using your system? And if they say no, they get scratched off the list. No matter what they do, no matter how good they are, if we can't get our data back, we won't use them.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Phil. All right, jumping into the next question. If I build software in a certified cloud, do I need to worry about security and managing my risk?
Yeah, I love app developers. They're lovely people who, and I've worked with a lot of them, and I've even been one at one point in my past, so I feel confident in saying this. We've seen quite a lot of app developers who say, but I'm building it in AWS or I'm building it in Azure, and they provide all the security, which means that I don't have to do security testing. I don't have to build safely because my cloud provider is doing all the security for them. And unfortunately, they've misunderstood what the cloud provider is offering. So I'll give you an analogy. Most people's car today has anti-lock brakes, it has seatbelt pre-tensioners, it has airbags, it has all of these security features that are built in by the manufacturer to keep you safe. But they don't stop you speeding. They don't stop you drink driving. They don't stop you texting while driving. They don't stop you driving on the wrong side of the road. Even the safest car is not safe if you're not operating it safely. And software development is exactly the same. The cloud providers are providing a really good, safe foundation for you to develop software on. But if you aren't using good software development techniques and have a secure SDLC, or have built security into your agile processes, then you are going to be operating your software dangerously on a safe platform, and that doesn't make you safe. You'll still be caught by SQL injection, you'll still be caught by cross-site scripting, you'll still be caught by all of those OWASP top 10 things, even if you're on a certified secure platform. Love app developers.
Thank you, Phil. In the interest of time, we might press on. I used to do internal security reviews, but if I move to the cloud, do I still need to do them, and what needs to be included?
Do you want me to start and Phil to finish? So, I mean, Phil's come from a business that I think can answer this question, really well. But I'll start by saying, well, you won't do internal security reviews because your stuff's now on someone else's disks, right? As Phil said, cloud is just using someone else's spinning disk or series of disks. But you will need to do what I'd be saying, like a cloud conformity review, if that's even a thing. Phil will correct me on the right term. So the short answer is yes, you're just shifting the type of scrutiny you need. You just got to make sure that you've got the right dial set, the right policies turned on, the right things closed and the right things open. So yes, you just by moving to cloud doesn't remove your obligation to be checking the security settings of your organization. It just shifts risk to a different place. I'd argue it should shift risk down because it's more likely these cloud providers will do security better than you keeping a server under your desk. And therefore you're just going to shift the way you do your security. But I'll let Phil answer that more articulately. At least I do, if I do nothing else on these webinars, Shannon, is make the other person look smarter.
I think you look smart. That's exactly the right answer. But probably a good example of how people get this wrong is unsecured AWS S3 buckets. How much data has been stolen off of those? In the past, we've done security reviews by looking at configuration settings of operating systems, looking at configuration settings of firewalls, doing internal penetration testing to find out where we forgot to patch something or forgot to turn something on or turn something off. Still need to do that, just use different tools. So instead of doing operating system reviews, you do cloud security reviews. And there are a set of standard approaches to doing this. What it changes is you need a different set of skills. Someone who's been good at doing internal penetration testing and understands Windows down to the last nut and bolt and can secure it really well may not be able to do an awesome cloud security review because all the knobs and buttons that they're used to twitching or turning or looking at don't really exist. There's another set. I think AWS has like 2,000 different controls that you can set. You need special skills to understand even how to set them the right way. As I said before, you get a secure base platform and most of the dials are set to something good off the bat. If you don't touch them, they're probably okay. But again, that probably has a little asterisk next to it and going, your mileage may vary. You may have different needs. You still need to do this because right back to what I said up front, you're still responsible for the data in the cloud provider. And if you didn't configure it correctly or you didn't understand how they configured it by default for you, you're still responsible.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Thank you, Almac. Last question before we jump into the final poll and then jump into the rapid fire. There are a range of frameworks available for cloud security controls. Which one would you choose and why? And I guess maybe the second part of that question, are cloud certifications meaningful?
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. The most well understood cloud security framework is called C* from the Cloud Security Alliance. And that's pretty good, but it's not one that's easy to get certified against. And if you look at the Cloud Security Alliance site and you look at all of the people who've gone through the C* security control framework, the vast majority of them say self-assessed, self-assessed, self-assessed. You don't get to mark your own homework in this. If I say I'm secure, great, you can believe me, but I don't know why you should. You should make sure that I've got tested and I'm secure because someone else says I'm secure. So the problem with the specific cloud security frameworks is they're very largely self-assessed. And I don't put a lot of stock in that. The idea is good, the implementation not so much. The cloud certifications I like are actually not cloud certifications, they're business certifications. And I mentioned a few of them up front, like ISO 27001 or NIST 800-171 or SOC 2 or the IRAP standards for government work. Those aren't just about cloud. Those are about the way it is built, the way it is deployed, the way it is managed, the way it is disposed of afterwards, their whole life cycle of keep your information safe. And if we focus just on the technical controls, we've missed the management of the process. And the management of the process is at least as important as the technical controls. If we just focus on the management of the process, we might have terrible technical controls underneath. We need something that does this full life cycle end to end. And I think those organizational certifications are much more important than specific cloud security frameworks.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Phil, any comments or additional contributions from your end, Alastair?
I found I could find that mute button, Shannon, which shows you my high technical skills, which should inspire people to hear my answer to this question. Look, I think Phil's right. I mean, yeah, go with Phil's advice. I like the Cloud Security Alliance. I like it because it's a pretty pragmatic way of dealing with these matters. There is no such thing as perfection. Let me just get briefly on, and you know, you haven't asked me about BYOD this week, which I'm a bit disappointed about because generally speaking, I don't like it, just in case people didn't know. What I will talk about here then is frameworks. Frameworks and certifications are never perfect, and I love it when people will tell me that one is way better than another. I mean, there's clearly differentiation, and Phil again has extraordinary degree of knowledge, you know, the difference between a ISO 27001 and some other certification. But certifications and frameworks are there to give predictability and certainty and risk reduction on certain things. And therefore, I tend not to have too much religion on what one chooses, so long as you choose something. It's about the discipline and the rigor and the thinking associated, which actually starts answering the question for us. So my genuine answer is go with a credible international framework, just as you should with a credible international certification or a mandated one if you have to, if you're in a regulated industry, and think around the edges of it. Don't ever think that by sticking to a framework or a certification that it makes you bulletproof or completely secure, because we've all shown too often that just isn't the case.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Alastair. Well, that leads us into our final poll for the day. And the poll is, how important is it to you, to your organisation to utilise Australian domiciled cloud solutions? Option 1, vital. Australian resident data is a firm requirement, somewhat important. Require key information to stay on shore, not important. It's not an evaluation criteria, or you don't know. We'll probably give you a few more seconds to answer that. The one good thing is we've got a heap of questions that have come through in the rapid fire Q&A. So word of warning for Phil and Alastair, we might run through these fairly quickly today, if that's okay.
Okay, speed dating time.
Speed dating.
Awesome.
How about we time ourselves 30 seconds and answer?
And you know, Mac, only way before you were
I'm going to
a
give you a shot. Stretch goal. It's an ambition.
Very good. All right, so we're on the rapid fire now. The issue I've found is that cloud providers do updates on their environment, but the applications that sit on top of this are not part of it. And I think we're talking about IaaS or PaaS here. So you have to make sure that you take this up separately and maintain it. Any comments on having to ensure that your models are working efficiently, and how do you secure your applications if the underlying infrastructure is changing?
All right, so the quick answer to this is the world is different with cloud. In the past, we used to be able to say, we're going to deploy a system, we'll keep it, it'll just stay stationary, stay static, unchanged until we get rid of it. That doesn't work in cloud. If you believe it does, you're going to be in for some disappointment. You need to now move to a much more change is normal process. You have to keep up with your cloud provider. You don't get a choice.
Okay, fantastic. Next question. Cloud providers located in Australia, how to meet this requirement for DDoS mitigation services, as most of these are not Australian based and will need global data centers to be the most effective? Good question.
See, it is a good question, and it separates data from other things. Assuming we're talking about all encrypted traffic, then we're just talking packets. There's no actual data in them. There's nothing anyone could decode. So the data is only data when it's decrypted, right? When it's on the wire in encrypted form, it's not accessible. No one can steal it. No one can do anything with it. So, yeah, no real problem with using large international DDoS protection environments because they can't see it. So they're no different from internet routing. They simply can't see the data, therefore it's not data.
And I was just going to say, just like any internet routing, right? I could be sitting in Canberra today as I am, accessing some information that Phil has in Adelaide, and it's routing via the United States. I mean, so we've got to accept the fact that packets might go offshore. The question is whether data at rest should remain onshore or be in a provider that is domiciled onshore, even if the data's not. So let's not conflate all those issues.
Okay. Next question. By Australian cloud providers, are you ruling out hyperscale providers like Amazon and Microsoft who have significant footprint in Australia, or do you actually mean overseas clouds that don't have a footprint here?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Phil, tell me what you mean. I was going to answer for you.
Hyperscale's fine because they have. I think I said it in my top 5. If they just have a sales team here, no infrastructure here, no support people here, no nothing here, they're not here. They're not here. So if we're talking AWS and Microsoft, they both have huge deployments in Australia, run by Australians for Australians. They're great.
Okay.
Yep. Fantastic. I'm with Phil.
Okay, good. Alastair, one for you. More a comment. I'll take it as a comment. All tech vendors end products. Microsoft give you 2 years notice contractually. Surely that's fair, and maybe put a question mark at the end of it.
Sorry, I don't understand the question or the statement. Is that saying that there's end of life support? So, for example, XP doesn't get supported, or do you think? I'm just polling you guys here. Do you think that's what the question means?
I think it's more like the Skype for Business thing, where they're just going to say we're turning it off in 2 years.
Yeah.
So
well,
2 years. That's quite a long time. But you have to be able to understand that because you're taking the reduction in cost and the up in security by using cloud, you're also wearing some cost yourself, which is you just don't get to be stationary anymore.
Okay.
No, that's 2 years does seem plenty of time.
All right, very good. Even though you selected an Australian cloud provider and they are certified, etc., how can you be guaranteed that backup data is not stored in one of their overseas data centers? This has happened.
Again, we're using the word guaranteed like it has a meaning other than outside the contractual agreement that you have. Maybe you can't, but then you should have set up the terms for this up front. Get a lawyer to read the terms and conditions. If you don't like it, pick a different one. And if you can't do that, do a risk assessment on it and decide whether you can cope with this. Now, none of the stuff that Alastair and I talked about today are absolutes. These are guidelines. These are what we think you should do to keep you safe. But in the end, this is a you decision. This is a risk that you need to understand you're taking, and you need to be happy with the mitigations that you put in to protect yourself.
Okay, fantastic. I think I've got another one I'll probably read as a comment. And then I've got, in regards to the Assistance and Access Act of 2018, how would you approach a client that is concerned about using Australian cloud-based data centres?
Alastair, this is for you, mate.
Repeat the question, sorry.
Okay, so in regards to the Assistance and Access Act of 2018, how would you approach a client that is concerned about using Australian cloud-based data centres?
I just laugh, because if anyone actually thinks that act would be used for the purposes of breaking encryption on clouds domiciled in Australia, they misunderstand the intent of the act. I mean, look, there's this concept of what a law is intended for and how it's being used. And when you look at the reports of how the Access and Assistance Bill and therefore the subsequent act has been used, it's been used a handful of times at the lowest level, if that makes sense. In terms of the highest one, where it was the compulsion to decrypt, you will be compelled, you must break the encryption. It's just not done. But having the law on the books is a necessary evil, frankly, if you're trying to protect a population. Again, there was an awful lot of huffing and puffing around around that act at the time, and I, obviously quite publicly came out and supported it. And I'd say I feel a bit vindicated. It just like metadata retention, which will probably be like covering myself in honey and rolling on an ant's nest. I don't think it's been misused, and it's actually helped catch criminals and stop terrorist acts. That's the whole aim of this legislation. Same with the Access and Assistance Bill. People argued that all these companies would pull out of Australia. Guess what? They didn't. What people want, back to Phil's initial thesis, is they actually want predictability and the rule of law. You just want the right type of rule of law, and that's one from a liberal Western democracy, because they tend to support citizens better.
And here's the thing, just to take that one to a practical level. If you look at the Act, as I have, maximum penalty under it's $10 million. The hyperscale providers are all nearly $1 trillion companies now. They could just eat that fine every single day as part of doing business and move on. It doesn't have enough teeth to actually bind or bite those that you'd worry about. So move on. It's not going to be a terrible problem, I think.
Okay, fantastic. Well, look, guys, we do have a few more questions, but I think they're going to require a bit more of an expansive answer, so we might sort of take them offline and get back to the individuals who've asked them. Look, I'd like to thank you very much, Alastair and Phil, for participating today. I think it's been a really healthy conversation, and hopefully the information that we've shared today has been thought-provoking around the data sovereignty issue as it relates to your organisation, and potentially how you reshape, rethink, and consume cloud solutions. So thanks, gentlemen. That's been very, very good. We'd also like to thank all of the attendees for attending today's session. I'd also like to remind you that we'll be running another great webinar on the 10th of June, and this webinar will focus on the skills aspect of cyber sovereignty. In that webinar, we'll again feature Alastair MacGibbon, so thanks for volunteering yet again, Alastair. That's fantastic. And we'll also have Snez Yankolovsky, who is the Chief People Officer here at CyberCX, and she'll bring a unique insight into sovereign skills development and skills resiliency. As I've said before, CyberCX is definitely here to listen and to help. Please talk to us about your challenges and send us a question, because that will inform better cyber dialogues into the future. I'll now like to sort of put forward the poll results, if that's okay. We'll just present those to provide that feedback to you all. So where are we? Okay, so poll response number 1, how actively do you utilize cloud solutions? Again, extensively for 40%, moderately for 42%, limited to 15%. Looks like nobody is in the position where they do not use cloud solutions, and we've got probably one response where they don't know whether they're using it at all, which is 2%, or maybe 2 people, given our numbers. Second question. How important is it to your organisation to utilise Australian domiciled cloud solutions? And 40% view it as vital, 40% view it as somewhat important, 17% not at all important, and due to the rounding wonders of the world, we've got 4% who don't know, so slightly more.
Pretty interesting though, don't you reckon? I mean, that's amazing. The vast bulk of organisations sit in those first couple of categories, and I'm actually really heartened by that.
Yeah, it's good insight. All right, that pretty much brings our webinar for today to a conclusion. Please do hang on and provide us with a little bit of guidance around a follow-up poll, which will help us produce better Q&A webinars by completing the survey at the end of the session, letting us know if you have any other topics you'd like us to cover, because as mentioned, we will be able to customize our cyber dialogues according to your requirements. As also mentioned, everyone will receive a copy of the recording via email today, and we'll also be posting a link on our website should you wish to have a look at that at some other time. Thanks again for attending, and have a great day.